Welcome back to the Alternative Highs podcast. Today's podcast is extra special. Today I'm joined by Dr. Madeline,
you got it.
Madeline Verhasic. She's the Chief Medicine at St. Joseph Healthcare in Hamilton, professor at McMaster University specializing in hematology. Dr. Verhasic is the leading expert in sickle cell disease and hemoglobin disorders. Today we're going to talk about sickle cell. We're going to, I wanted to help myself to understand and help other people that aren't really familiar with sickle cell and how we can be allies, how we can help, what we can do. So with that being said, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So excited.
Yes. So how did you get here? Like first, before I even get into asking anything sickle cell, how did you get to where you're at today? Like what, did you just get it done high school and decide I want to be hemoglobin?
Definitely not. So I grew up in Richmond Hill, went to high school in King City, so kind of north of Toronto, and made my way to McMaster for my undergraduate degree. And at the time, I think I had a pretty solid idea that I was interested in doing medicine. But interestingly, when it was time partway through my first year to choose my major, I wasn't going for the hardcore biology, biochemistry that a lot of the other medical school keeners were kind of going for. I was actually really drawn to psychology. I really loved my psychology course in first semester, and then the second part in second semester. I thought, no, this is where I want to focus my attention on. So I ended up majoring in psychology, spending a lot of time both on the behavioral psychology side, but also on the neuroscience, like how our brains work and how it helps us to process our experiences in the world. Spent some time working in a lab, learning about how our brain processes what we see, and then got into medical school, and kind of through a process of, thankfully medical school lets you test out a whole bunch of different things, family medicine, surgery. I did electives abroad and did a whole bunch of different things, helped to deliver babies for a couple of weeks during my first summer.
So much.
Yeah. So I had no idea what I was interested in. It was all really cool, and kind of very gradually worked my way to a focus in hematology over the many years, 13 years of post-high school education before I started into practice.
That's
crazy.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's the most schooling I think of anybody I've met today. So coming through now, could you explain in the simplest way for somebody how to understand sickle cell?
Yeah. So sickle cell is a disorder of the red blood cells. So when we see our blood, if we get a cut, it looks red. And so that's because our red blood cells make up about half of the blood that's flowing through. Other things are in our blood, right? You get blood tests for other things. They'll check for diabetes. They'll check for your kidney tests and your liver tests and that kind of thing. So our blood can tell us a lot about our health, but when it comes right down to it, and if you were to look under a microscope, about half of the total volume of what's flowing through in our blood is red blood cells. So it's really, really important. And red blood cells do a lot of things, but their primary role, the main thing they do, is carry oxygen from our lungs, pick up oxygen from when we take a breath, to then delivering it around our body. Super important. Every part of our body needs oxygen in order to function.
Yep.
So what ends up happening then inside each red blood cell, there's a little molecule that you can't even see under a microscope. It's so microscopic, called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is actually that thing that carries the oxygen. It picks up the oxygen, delivers it to the part of the body. Super duper important. And we all have encoding in our DNA, in our genetics, that tells our body how to construct that hemoglobin in a proper way. We all do. Sickle cell is a problem with the set of instructions for making hemoglobin. It's the teeny tiniest problem, it's a code that's thousands of letters long, and there's just one letter that's misspelled in the DNA sequence. So I say, kind of like if you're reading a book or if somebody's flipping through the newspaper, just imagine there's just one typo, one letter that's made a mistake. You would just gloss right over that and not even really think about it. In this case, that letter changes the shape of the hemoglobin molecule so that it's still able to pick up and deliver oxygen. But once it completes that task of delivering the oxygen to the wherever it's going, let's say up to your brain, delivers that oxygen, it actually changes shape, the protein does, in such a way that unfortunately, and it's hard to even conceptualize, maybe I'm happy to share some pictures with you. Not sure if you're able to cut in some pictures into the podcast. So what it does is that then each of those molecules, because of their shape, they end up gravitating toward each other, almost like electricity, you know? Okay. And then rather than them floating around nicely inside the red blood cell, they click together almost like pieces of Lego, imagine that, into a hard rod. And when that happens several times within the red blood cell goes from being a nice, flat-shaped disc that's really bendable to being shaped like a sickle. So it's kind of shaped like a banana. And rather than being soft and flexible, it ends up being pointy and hard and rigid, and it gets stuck places. So you end up getting log jams in the teeny tiny blood vessels of these banana-shaped or sickle-shaped red blood cells, and then the blood can't flow. Okay. And so you get all kinds of trouble. Stopping blood flow can end up causing a stroke, can end up causing damage to bones. And the major thing that almost everybody, if not everybody with sickle cell will have, is episodes of terrible pain when the blood flow stops and all of a sudden that part of their body, usually part of their bones often, just isn't getting blood flow anymore. And it hurts like nothing else.
And that's crisis mode.
That's crisis mode.
And how... Is it just, this is really quite, I don't know how to word this. The pain could go anywhere? It doesn't just have a specific spot, it'll go anywhere in the body and you can be painful? Legs, shoulders?
100%. So the main, when we talk about crisis mode or a sickle cell crisis, there's lots of different names for it. Painful crisis or a vaso-occlusive episode is the very scientific name for it. Okay. And just breaking that down, vaso-occlusive, so it's occlusion, blockage of a blood flow. Okay. And an episode or a crisis. The main time where that's happening is a blood flow blockage to the spongy part of our bone where the blood is supposed to be being produced and where the blood's supposed to be flowing. So when we're first born, every bone in our bodies has that spongy bone part. So for a little baby with sickle cell, they could have that crisis happen anywhere. Fingers, toes, legs, arms, ribs, spine, any bone in the body, and it would just be random. It would just be where that blockage happens that day.
Now, since you brought up babies, how soon can people be tested for sickle cell?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. You can diagnose it right at birth.
Yeah, okay.
And in fact, I mean, thinking even before that.
As I say, do they run tests to...
Yeah. I mean, you can actually, if a family suspects that a baby before it's even born might have sickle cell, there are ways of testing before the baby's even born. But in Ontario and in lots of other places, there's something called newborn screening. Okay. And they take the newborn, they do a heel prick so that they get a little drop of blood that goes onto a specialized testing filter paper that goes to the central lab in Ottawa. So any parent who accepts to have their baby tested through that process, they test for a couple of dozen different genetic conditions, but one of them is sickle cell. Yeah. So you can know right from, and then they get the results fairly quickly. from that testing, and if that baby had sickle cell, then again in Ontario, they'd be connected in really quickly with specialty clinic.
I was going to say, since
Yeah.
we are in Ontario,
Yeah.
what is taking care of sickle cell from birth to adult? What does
Yeah.
that look like? How does one go about it? Like, there's not proper funding from what I understand. It's not registered. Like, how do you take care of it? How does this move through?
It's such a big question, and even as you're asking the question and thinking of the different kind of aspects of it, just thinking from a big picture,
Yeah.
I think we're making good progress,
Mm-hmm.
and there's still a long way to go.
Yep.
So sickle cell has been in Ontario for probably a century or more.
Yeah.
And it's really only in the past 1 to 2 decades, I would say, where there has been that focused attention on specialty care and what we would call comprehensive care. I'll just say, I can quickly explain our clinic at McMaster just as an example of what the care would look like across the age lifespan. So in the case of a family who has a new baby, maybe they knew that the baby had a chance of having sickle cell, maybe they had no idea. You know, you would need 2 parents who are carriers usually of the sickle cell gene, and either another parent with the sickle cell gene, or it can sometimes combine with some other genes to cause sickle cell disease. So those parents may or may not have known that they were carriers beforehand.
Okay.
Here they have a baby who they're being told has sickle cell disease. Interestingly, because of how quickly the testing results come through, and because sickle cell complications don't start to show up usually until 6 months or later,
Okay.
they have usually a perfectly well little baby there.
Yeah.
They'll often see them in the clinic by the age of 3 months or so the baby hasn't had any problems at all. And I look after adults, so I'm trained to look after 18 and up, but the other doctors, nurses, the social work, the other team members in the pediatric side of our clinic will meet with that family, explain to them the results, explain to them what this means, talk about both the acute complications, so those sudden complications like the pain crises, as well as some of the long-term complications that can happen, and then start diving into some of the solutions, some of the prevention measures. So really important is immunizations, not just the regular immunizations, but extended series of immunizations because of extra infections that baby will be more prone to through its life. Putting them on daily antibiotic treatment, at least for the first 5 years of life, again, to prevent them from having those complications. Most likely from an early age, starting them on a pill called hydroxyurea, which is a pill that helps to strengthen the blood and decrease the amount of sickling. And hopefully help that family to process all of this.
Yeah.
Help to link them in with other families, with patient organizations, with any other information that they need. And it ends up being then a long journey together where the team is supporting that baby and that family and trying to keep the baby as well as possible so that they're thriving both in terms of health, and then as the years go on, thriving so that they're able to attend as much school as possible, spend as little time at appointments and in the hospital. And then it just kind of continues over the years.
And you're trained with adults. What's an adult's life look like with sickle cell? David is a mutual friend of ours.
David is my patient, so I wouldn't be able to talk about his medical details, but I know he's...
I did a pod with him earlier, or late last year.
Yeah.
What a beautiful human.
Yeah.
And so I hadn't had the experience. I didn't know anything about it until this project was presented. And I want to try and help as much as I possibly can. So understanding the adult side of it, like what's in the worst case scenario, what's the easiest way to understand it in the adult's life, like for moving through day to day and trying to understand that?
Yeah. And again, that's a huge question and really important for us to focus on the adults, because I think, once newborn screening came in, I don't want to say the problem, but you don't know how many people there are until you start going out and looking, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the Ontario Ministry of Health really focused their efforts on, okay, let's do newborn screening. And very soon they realized that sickle cell disease was the most common genetic disease that they were diagnosing in this newborn screening. Mm. They didn't have any idea that that was going to be the case. They didn't expect that, right? Yeah. And so then it's like, okay, now we've got all these babies. We've got to make sure that there's good care for the pediatric. But what happens to those kids when they become adults? Yeah. And I will say, to answer your question, what is life like for an adult? I think talking to David was probably one of the best ways for you to 100%. Really understand that, and hearing exactly from the person who's living with sickle cell. And I will say that there's a range of how it affects people's life. Mm-hmm. There are some folks, for example, whose body and their blood responds very well to hydroxyurea as a treatment, mm-hmm. and it keeps their body and their blood strong, and save for maybe extra medical appointments and occasional small pain crises, they're able to, have a life partner and have a family and hold down a full-time job. And this ends up being something that they can mostly put on the back burner, and as long as they're focusing and attending to their appointments and things like that, they're able to thrive in their lives. And we're really thankful that there are folks who are able to thrive in their lives. Yep. There are folks in the middle where they're doing okay. Yep. They're managing to hold down a job. They're managing to keep all of this stuff in the air, but they're often just sitting there waiting for when the next, crisis is going to come, or they hope that that's not going to come, but in the back of their mind, that's something that's just that you don't ever know when it's going to come. And there are things that someone with sickle cell, there are certain things that can trigger these crises, right? Like dehydration, or if you have a fever or a virus, or we were talking about the immunizations, or even just cold exposure. So we spend a lot of time. And the kids know by the time they're teenagers, they're like, yeah, I know, I've got to wear my warm coat. I can't go out in the cold, right? Or else it's going to trigger a crisis. Or even on the other extreme, on a hot day, you got to stay cool. You can't stay out, if you're out at a music festival, you got to stay hydrated. You got to stay in the shade, right? And sometimes that's not, like, it really cramps somebody's what they want to do. So, and then for some folks, they really have, whether it's the number of crises, or sometimes you get into chronic pain that becomes very difficult. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are complications, like folks we know who have had a stroke, and it now affects everything. It affects their whole life trajectory. Their physical ability to move, the way that they were able to complete their university studies before compared to now, or someone, I'm thinking of one person who was a really talented track athlete and then developed something called avascular necrosis of the hip and ended up needing a hip replacement surgery, and that again changed the whole trajectory of their life, and this was directly because of sickle cell. And then, I hesitate to go here because we don't even have the statistics for Canada. There's a coalition of really phenomenal researchers and sickle cell physicians through the Canadian Hemoglobinopathy Association who are working after actually over a decade of trying. It feels we're hopeful that we may be getting much closer to having a registry for Canada so that we know who has sickle cell across the country. How many people, how answering this question, what is their life like? What is the burden of medical problems that they're having? And what is the life expectancy? What's the average life expectancy for someone with sickle cell in Canada? Because other than trying to look at publicly available data in clever ways. Right now, we don't have a way to really answer these questions. So a lot of the times when we're trying to figure out what's going on with these things, we're looking at research from the United States or research from abroad. And it's an important problem in Canada. So we need more data so that we can support folks.
Next question.
Yeah.
How do you think that comes together for the registry? If they've been working on it for a decade, what pushes that to the finish line? How do we get to the finish line?
It's a really excellent question. I think there's many components. It's kind of like you got to have all the ingredients and all the pieces assembled just so. So right now, as I mentioned, we've got an excellent and talented and really committed group of researchers and physicians from across the country, trying to create kind of that foundation of what would this registry look like, how would it start, and it is such a big undertaking that part of it needs to be like, okay, how do we do this in a stepwise way? Like how do we start with something, like with anything, you want to test it out on a smaller scale. So they're working on that. I think then trying to grow that coalition of researchers and physicians so that in every main center to start with, and then ideally even outside of the main centers eventually, you need to have leads or champions who are willing to say, okay, I'm going to be the lead here. So they're working on that. And then you think you can't do any of this with $0, right? You can have all the willing people that you want, but the technology needs to be there. We're in an age where something like a registry needs to have a certain software and the build of the actual template of how the data is going to be collected. Super important that it's secure because this is people's private health information. Super important that it's following all of the best practices for research ethics so that we're not having identifiable details in there and that people are just contributing, they're signing, the patients are consenting to have their information on there, but that there's no chance somebody's going to go, looking at their individual stuff, right? So there's all of these principles of research that need to be followed. And I think it's not just that startup funding for it, but it's like, okay, yeah, you can contribute. Oh yeah, we're going to get a software developer to kind of build this, but then sustainability. So that not only are you doing an intake with any patients coming through a clinic, but you need to be updating that information each time they're coming back to clinic or on some sort of a regular basis. Hey, how are you doing now? And doing a head to toe. Have you had a stroke since the last time? Has there been these other things? And sometimes trying to, in clever and appropriate ways, how can we minimize the amount of strain on patients and families, right? You can imagine how tiresome that would be. Okay, 100%. Now I got to spend an hour answering 100 questions with you in addition to my medical appointment. So how can we use technology to be able to pull some of this information from where it already is in the medical record, again, in ways that protect the patient's privacy, that are completely above board and appropriate as it relates to the research ethics part of it. So I think at this moment where the hurdle that like the critical hurdle is funding.
I was going to say is
the expertise is there, the coalition of the willing is there.
Funding or
they're honestly working to explore all options. There has been a thought, and I agree. I mean, I think the Sickle Cell Association of Canada has really been phenomenal, and working with our Senate colleagues, and I know with MP Matthew Green, looking at trying to create a national framework for sickle cell, so that we're not just focusing on individual cities or provinces, but really looking across the board. And I think if money was no object, and even if money is an object, knowing that you've got a registry that's looking across Canada, what better tool to help with planning the clinical services? What better tool to help with planning, to understanding where the pockets are of folks who may be underserved, where there's a lot of growth, right? What better to help you with planning how you're going to create that comprehensive care network of clinics across the country than to have a registry that tells you exactly the information about how many people, what age spread, what medical complexity do they have, so that you can target the intervention. So I think, in an ideal world, having a national strategy for sickle cell that's underpinned by a national registry would be really the holy grail of all of this. And then it's really just trying to work with the policymakers and try to create something that's feasible. That's, what can I say? Obviously, it's all taxpayer dollars, so you want to make sure that it's being used well.
Yeah. And this is just, does the U.S. have a registry for sickle cell?
They do and they don't. They've got a couple of registries that are mostly research registries, and then otherwise, I think historically they've done a better job at collecting the data related to sickle cell, so that when researchers or policymakers do try to pull publicly available data, and by that I mean what the Ministry of Health would have access to. It's more clear being able to pull and understand who exactly has sickle cell and who doesn't.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can get somewhere with that.
Yeah.
You said money. Earlier I kind of put a pin in. This is off. Is there a sickle cell, like, is there a pill you can take that just no more sickle cell?
Right.
Is there anything,
wouldn't
cure?
that be great?
Is there a cure?
It's not that simple, but we're getting closer.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of research increasingly over the past, let's say, 10 to 15 years in terms of looking at different ways of treating sickle cell, looking at different parts of the science of what causes the problem and trying to address those with a pill or an infusion. And there's been some success, but it's been up and down. Yeah. Just in the past year, there was one treatment that was actually pulled off the market. It didn't ever come to market in Canada, but pulled off the market out elsewhere, because although there was some early promise, in the end, once it had been out there for a while, it wasn't clear that it was doing the good that everybody had hoped it would. So there have been ups and downs. Yeah. The main focus, I would say, and the main enthusiasm now is more around what could be potentially curative treatments, which are definitely not just take a pill. It's very involved. To quote my colleague, Dr. Kevin Kuo from University of Toronto, high risk, high reward. Yeah. So that's like a stem cell transplant. I was
going to say stem cell?
Or gene therapy.
Okay.
Yeah, which I'm happy to go into kind of, if that would be helpful, what those are.
If you can explain that. I'm very fascinated with stem cell.
Yeah, so stem cell transplants have been around for a long time. They initially came into common use for treatment of malignant conditions like leukemia, as a way to be able to give the person very potent chemotherapy, which would basically wipe out their immune system and their bone marrow. And then the stem cell transplant was a way of giving them somebody else's stem cells, which are the seed cells that would then be able to help regenerate their red blood cells, their white blood cells, their platelets, their blood, and would help to repopulate their bone marrow. So a way I think of that is, if you imagine you've got a garden, the garden's overgrown with weeds, you got to get in there, do your weed treatment. It just wipes that garden clean. But then you've got this kind of soil that's just sitting there, and it's actually, you know, a little bit toxic with all the chemicals, and you end up getting back in there and putting some seeds. So it's a similar thing that the stem cell transplant does. In sickle cell, we don't have to give massive doses of chemotherapy. We're not trying to wipe out a nasty growing weed. But we do need to clear out the body's production of sickle cells, right? So they use treatments that are less toxic, and they will clear out the person's. It'll clear out the person's bone marrow, and then a similar principle where they'll give a donation of somebody else's stem cells. So it's a pretty involved process.
Is it
And
successful?
It's successful, and even kind of backing it up a few steps. The biggest challenge is whether that person has a match or not, because you've probably most people realize that even for blood donations, you could be blood group A, blood group B, blood group AB, or blood group O, and then it can be either negative or positive. So some people are O negative, some people are O positive, etc. So even for a blood transfusion, you couldn't just get a blood transfusion from me or from someone else. We would need to make sure that we're a match, right? Okay. And then, of course, lots else goes on behind the scenes to process that blood before it goes from one person to another. For a stem cell transplant, it's even more complicated because the match has to be even that much more precise. It's not just for the blood group, it's for immune compatibility. Because, worst case scenario, if you or I got a stem cell transplant from somebody who was not a match, not only would the seeds not take, but those seeds and the what come from those seeds would actually start to attack at our body and at our body's tissues. So that immune incompatibility, and it's called graft versus host disease. So if we're going to take someone with sickle cell who doesn't have a malignant condition, who's experiencing complications of that sickle cell disease, and we want to try to clear out the sickle cell and replace it with something healthy, you need to make sure that that other person's a perfect match. It's very hard to find a perfect match if you're just to go out into the population. So it's usually a matched sibling. With that all in mind, if someone doesn't have a sibling at all, that becomes therefore very challenging, and most of the time it takes that option of stem cell transplant off the table. If they do have a sibling, it's taking that sibling through HLA testing and the person with sickle cell and seeing if they're a match. If they've got multiple siblings, it's testing all of the siblings. So that's hurdle number one with the stem cell transplant. Okay. Also, because it's high risk, high reward, we want to make sure that we're selecting the right person. If someone has not had any complications of their sickle cell, it's not clear that that risk is going to be worth it, right? So there's some criteria about what complications someone has to have had in order to make this a worthwhile risk-benefit ratio. And then on the other side of that, someone might be too sick. Let's say they have a donor, but they've got too much going on in terms of their own personal health, that it actually tips the risk, makes the risk actually that much higher. And maybe they would really benefit from this, but maybe they wouldn't, maybe their health wouldn't be able to last through the procedure. So it's really tricky.
It's a tough call.
It's really tricky. Up until recently in Ontario, they hadn't even been offering this to adults. They had been doing it for a handful of carefully selected children. And then just in the past couple of years, they've started to offer the treatment at Princess Margaret Hospital. I'm sure the number has gone up from there, but as of last summer, they had done 12 adults, was the number that I had heard. And again, it's probably gone up by a small number since then. And it sounds like it's been very successful overall. Sounds like things have been going well, thanks to science. Yeah. And thanks to very carefully selecting the donor, the recipient, very careful protocols of what's called the conditioning regimen, that treatment that the person receives before the stem cell infusion, and then very careful, attentive care afterwards.
Yeah.
So it's not just taking a pill at all. It's a big commitment. It's a big commitment as a healthcare system as well, because of course this is a big investment into that person's future health.
Yeah.
Gene therapy, though, which we can chat about.
Yeah.
I know there's lots of buzz about gene therapy. Gene therapy, in its best form, is a way for everybody to get a stem cell transplant type treatment.
Okay.
In the sense that you don't need another donor. What happens is you'll take someone with sickle cell, do a stem cell harvest, bring that bag that looks like a bag of blood, but it's got stem cells in there, re-engineer those stem cells, and there are different ways of doing that to try to interrupt that sickle cell process. And then the person goes through a conditioning regimen that's similar to what someone goes through for a stem cell transplant. But in this case, after that conditioning regimen, after that treatment to clear out their own sickle cell, then they end up getting their own re-engineered stem cells infused back into them. So the experience of that person ends up being very similar to somebody who goes through a stem cell transplant, except there's no donor, they're their own donor.
Okay.
And from a cost standpoint, this ends up being, so far anyway, ends up being something that's proprietary to the companies who've developed the technology.
Okay.
So while there's not a magic pill that they're giving someone, there is kind of a magic process that then has a charge associated with it.
Okay.
So gene therapy right now ends up being, it's not available in Canada yet,
Okay.
but hopefully will be available soon to carefully selected folks.
Okay. Are people leaving here to go get?
That's a great question. I haven't heard of anybody leaving.
Okay.
Many people have been asking me about,
Yeah.
right? Where could I go? I think there are people in Canada who have had the gene therapy because it's been available at certain centers in Canada on the research trial.
Okay.
So there are a number of people who've had the gene therapy but as part of the research trial, and now we're just waiting for it to be available as part of regular medical care.
Do you think that'll be like in the very near future? Or
I'm not right at the heart of having my finger on the pulse of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Just disclosure, I was doing a behind the scenes. I was kind of behind the scenes a part of one of the trials, not in a direct way, but evaluating some of the event. It's called the Endpoint Adjudication Committee, so kind of behind the scenes. So I'm specifically staying arm's length from things. But from what I hear, things are coming along well. There's been a great coalition of, again, experts from coast to coast looking at what would we recommend in terms of who should have access to this? What would we recommend in terms of how this should be designed from a care design standpoint? Like, should it be available at every single major hospital, or should it only be in one place in each province? And like, if so, how do we make sure that even if someone doesn't live close to there, that they're able to access it? So really trying to think through so that when the government in each of the provinces comes through with the funding, making sure that then they're ready to really ready to go. So I suspect it'll be available in the next year or two.
Oh,
that's
cool.
my, because it's been the one gene therapy has been approved by Health Canada, and now it's just a matter of figuring out in each of the provincial healthcare systems how to structure and fund that.
Yeah, that's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Talk about that another time too.
Yeah.
So, if how is me? How could I be a good ally? How could I help? How could I do my part?
Gosh, you're doing it.
I want to do more.
Yeah.
So what's that look like?
I think it looks different for each person.
Yeah.
And we each gravitate to certain, we use our skills and our interests and our experiences to help in different ways, right?
Yeah.
So for some people, it ends up being joining on as volunteers with one of the provincial advocacy and patient organizations, and helping in all different ways, helping with organizing their fundraising gala, or helping to run education sessions or that kind of thing. For some people, it ends up being kind of lobbying our politicians and trying to find ways to raise awareness there, because ultimately they hold the purse strings to funding for both treatments and care. I think raising awareness is something that you're doing right here with your podcast, raising awareness about this and lots of other things. So that's huge, because I think up until recent years, sickle cell has been considered a rare disease. And I think in Canada, as our population has become more diverse in particular, I think two things have been happening. Number one, this condition can affect anybody from any walk of life or any ancestry, but it's most common in folks whose ancestry, whether that's recently or remote, is from kind of tropical areas, in particular areas that have malaria, so through sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, India. So it's largely a condition of Black and racialized folks in Canada, which, together with other aspects of how decisions are made about care and funding, historically has led it to be very marginalized. In the past 5 to 6 years, where there's been an increased awareness of health equity, increased awareness of systemic racism and how it affects policy and funding decisions, there's been more awareness of racism in healthcare, both on an interpersonal level and in decision making. So I think, as someone who's not Black, who's not racialized, I find that I'm often in that position where I'm needing to call that out and be an ally in that way and say, look, I'm a white person, I'm European ancestry, and I'm seeing that this group is being systemically disadvantaged. And I think that's a very important part of our allyship, is linking arms with our brothers and sisters of other racial backgrounds and saying, yeah, I'm seeing this too. We're all seeing this. We need to address this gap. So many ways, I think elevating the voices of people who are living with sickle cell, helping to support them in different ways.
Absolutely.
Right? The list goes on and on. It's never ending. And just, knowing that you are passionate about this is really exciting. And maybe then the next part through education is growing the numbers of people who want to be allies and want to support.
It's something that I really got to work hard at. I don't know if you know about the bike ride.
I do. I'm excited.
Try and hit every hospital and try and do my best to be a better ally, to help get this, just to help educate more people. Until this was brought up, I had no idea, and I thought that was really quite ignorant of myself, that I had no clue. And moving forward, this is something we're going to work really hard and diligent at, and I really appreciate your time today. This was extremely informative. My brain has been overloaded, but I appreciate you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
That was great.